Hello, everybody. We're trickling in. Yes. Good morning, everybody. Let's come on in. If you're still trickling in, help yourself to a cup of coffee or a breakfast. I know that breakfast is what brings us here, my family included. So I hope you'll enjoy that. But let's start our time with a prayer. Let's see if this works. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, loving God, thank you for all that you give us, for this fellowship, for this food, for your presence among us, and for the gift of your word, stories we tell our children and grandchildren. Bless us in our study today. Bless us in our walk with you, that we might know and feel your presence in our lives. Through Christ our Lord, I pray. Amen. If you did not get a handout, I have a couple of extras here, and there are some at the door as well. There you go. You're welcome. Come. Hello, family. Come on in. All right, so this is the fourth week of Noah and the Ark. And if you were looking for a sweet story about animals and a boat, you will be disappointed, and you have been disappointed, because Noah and the Ark is more a story of vengeance and anger and death than it is anything else until we start to tease it apart and dig in deeper. And we see, of course, that it is a story of promise and salvation, but you do have to sort through a lot of bodies to get there. Today's class is our fourth in this series. We started with the question, why did God want to flood the earth? And we saw a kind of shocking answer, which is that all creation, that humankind's nature was unalterably bent toward evil, which is a hard thing to encounter, but that's the reason. The second week we saw why did God choose Noah, which was a little bit about the flood itself, but also of course the ark, the story of the ark, and how what God preserved. And we talked about how that the Bible is very intentional about not calling it a boat or a ship, but calling it an ark. And an ark is like a treasure chest. It's a place where we put something that we want to keep, something that is sacred. And indeed, God puts in the ark a pair of every living thing, including Noah and his children. We'll get to those sons a little bit more today. And so we saw that despite this devastation, this desire God had to start all over again, that God wanted to hold on to what he had begun, and some of it was preserved. And so that's what we saw, the why Noah. Last week, we looked at why promise. What was God promising? And we know the rainbow. That's my favorite part of the story. It's probably yours too. We know the rainbow in the sky, and we remember that rainbow and flood have something to do with each other. But then when we read the text, we realize there's a lot more that God is promising. God is promising not to destroy the whole earth again, but God is also offering humankind the gift of meat. We had not eaten meat until that point, but there was strings attached. God said, you may eat the meat, but you can't have the blood. The blood belongs to me. It's kind of odd little bit. We also saw in that if a person spills another person's blood, that person's blood must also be spilled. So kind of a sense of justice pervading this text. And then we saw the bow in the cloud, but the language that God used about the bow leaves at least me a little unsettled, at least initially, when God says, when I see the bow in the cloud, I will remember my promise and not destroy the earth. As if to say, God is still ready to wipe us out. But then God says, oh, yeah, that's right. There's a rainbow. I remember now. Of course, that's human beings telling the story. That's humankind coming up with a story. And we tell the story that way for reasons, and we kind of sort it through it. And part of it is we come to that point where we realize that things are still troubling, that humankind is not really any different than it was the last time, and yet God, merciful God, withholds, restrains God's power, that even if God might be justified in what he did, and that's a perplexing statement that needs some unpacking, and we're not going to unpack it now, but even if, still God decides not to, and that's kind of where we are. We recognize God's power and our relationship to it, but our God is the God who withholds that power and promises always to. So that's kind of where we were. This week, we're kind of done with the flood, but it's after the flood, and we get a really perplexing story about Noah and Noah's sons, which again leaves my head spinning, which is why I love the Bible so much, because it often leaves my head spinning. But before we look at this week, anything you want to ask or remember from the last 3 weeks? If you were here, even if you weren't here, anything about the decision to flood the earth, about Noah and the ark and the animals, and about the promise that was made. Any other remembrances that you want to bring up or questions you want to ask? All right. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I'd forgotten that. If y'all were here last week, when the flood dried up, the first bit, Noah sent out a raven, and the raven flew over the face of the earth, and the raven's wings dried up the waters. That's a part of the story I don't often remember, and I hear Liz asking why. And my answer is I don't really know. What do you think? Yeah. Huh. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. Isn't that funny? Yeah, I'm right there with you. I'm right there with you. I don't know. It is strange. Mythical, larger than life story. And the Noah, at least as the story is told, there are like 4 different times that the earth dries up. Right? First the waters recede and the ark rests, and then the waters are back because the dove is around, and then the waters recede, and then Noah comes out, and then the ground is drying again. And so anyway, the raven as well. Which is to say that the act of the earth being dried was a supernatural action. This wasn't just a flood. This wasn't just a lot of rain and the sun dried it out. This was sort of God's strange power at work. Yeah, absolutely. Other remembrances from the last several times? If you did not pick up a handout, there are some by the door. And then I've got a couple of extras here. All right. Any other remembrances from the last couple of weeks? There you all go. All right, well, let's dig into the text. We don't have as much text to deal with today. If you're nervous, don't worry. We're not going to read all of that from chapter 10, where we get all the names that Mac Mayfield can pronounce, but nobody else can pronounce. But let's just hear the Genesis 9:18 to 29 story. Who might read that bit for us, that first paragraph? Who might read it? Somebody will read it. That was a wave, not a volunteer. I'll hand you all that. Who might read that for us, pretty please? Thank you so much. Let me bring you this, if I may. Hand that to you. Thank you, Julie.
The sons of Noah went out of the ark where Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Wait a minute. The sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These 3 were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was peopled. Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. He drank some of the wine and became drunk, and he lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward, and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers. He also said, Blessed by the Lord, my God, be Shem, and let Canaan be a slave. May God make space for Japheth, and let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died.
Thank you. Am I right in guessing that this is the part of the story we don't remember as well? No? All right, so it's bizarre. Let's just start with that. It's strange. It's bizarre. The question I want to get at, I don't think we'll answer it. Well, maybe we will, but I'll be surprised if we answer it. The question I want to get at is why tell this part of the story? That's kind of the topic for today. Why tell it? Like we didn't have to tell it. We could have jumped to, in fact, some scholars think that verses 28 and 29 are kind of where the flood story ends, and that this bit is just a tag along. We could have skipped this whole bit and gone straight to Noah lived another 350 years. When he was 950, he died, and then we keep on going. But why? So the question I'm not asking, but I'm asking, is why do we tell this story? But before we get at that, what catches your eye or your ear? What makes your head start to spin? What are the words or phrases or details in the story that you find yourself wrestling with? Here we go. And if it's been a while since you've been here, you'll remember that we're broadcasting and recording, which is why this microphone is important. Thank you for your patience. Shannon?
It kind of brings us back, or to me, thinking Adam and Eve's story, because he's ashamed of his nakedness, and it's kind of like we trace our roots back to Adam and Eve, but really we should be thinking about Noah and his sons as the beginning of mankind again.
Yes. Thank you. That's what a great insight. We talk so much about how the flood is a recreation story, right? That remember, the first thing that God does in the before creation even happens, right? The Spirit of God hovered over the waters, right? Then there's night and light and day, and then the waters get separated. Even before the stars are in the sky, the waters get separated. God restrains the flood, and then when the flood is described, it didn't just rain, though it did rain. The windows of heaven were opened, and the great deep burst forth, which is to say God undoes this creation thing, and now we're starting over. What a great observation to remind us how that Adam story went amiss, and one of the first ways that mistake was manifest is in the discovery of nakedness and the shame that comes with it. Thank you. Yeah. What else? What other tidbits grab your eye or your ear or your mind today? Thank you.
I think in this last in the paragraph, Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him. What had he done to him?
Yeah, yeah. What had he done? Right? Yes. Noah awakens from his wine, which is to say, he sobered up, kind of came to his senses, and he knew what his youngest son had done to him. But we find ourselves asking, what had he really done? Yeah. Hold on. Rob?
I guess I was a little floored by the fact that Noah cursed Canaan, and like what had he done? I guess he didn't honor his father. I guess would be the only thing I could think of that would be maybe, I'm not sure the crime fits the punishment except for maybe that.
Yeah. So the related question, which is, what he did was to see his father's nakedness, which, I can remember those embarrassing moments when I walked in on one of my parents in the bathroom, but neither of my parents cursed me because of it. And so Rob asks that question, which is, what's going on here? And so, which brings us back to the first question, which is, what did he really do? And what is that symbolic of? Is this code for something else, or does it just represent something bigger than just the seeing of his father? We'll get back to that. We'll get to that in a little bit. Aubrey.
Well, I think, too, it's unfortunate for Canaan because he's Ham's son. He didn't actually do anything, but his father. And so I'm thinking, well, maybe did Ham not forgive his father for having, because he went and told his brothers, look what Dad's done? Is he just being unforgiving? Is that why he's cursed? Because they just they were more forgiving and were loving to their father.
Yeah.
And he was just kind of showing, look how vulnerable and awful he has been.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. And so you get there's also a family dynamic here, and family's important. Family is kind of at the heart of this story, and the conflict that will erupt between families in the generations that follow. But there's something not only about seeing the nakedness, but also the reporting to the brothers, and that the brothers' response is different. And yet you bring us to that reality, which is the text says that Canaan is cursed, but Ham was the son, Canaan the grandson. What did Canaan ever do? Like, wouldn't it be even worse? Not if your father cursed you for walking into the bathroom, but if your father cursed your child. Like, what did my child ever do, right? So something bizarre is going on. And the people who wrote the story, the people who told the story, recognized it. Like, they knew something. They were not ignorant to those details. It's not like they turned in the paper and then the instructor saw the typo that was there. Like, we've had generations to hear this story and revise it, and yet this is given to us. So there's something about that strangeness that's supposed to draw us in, I think. Did you have something? Okay. What else? Anything else catch your eye or your ear? Yeah, thank you, Shannon.
Well, I just wondered if it's setting up the Canaanites for being the other.
Yeah, who are the Canaanites?
I don't know.
The other, right? Yeah,
The
yeah,
other.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah. Right, yeah. Well, the land of Canaan, right, which they go to, and so there's an element of ideology, EIT, ideology, which is a truth about life that gets explained in a story, right? And so, and sometimes humanity needs a story. The very next chapter, chapter 11, is the Tower of Babel. It's an ideological story, which is the reality is we all speak different languages. So let's tell a story about how that happened. The elephant's nose, right? You know these kind of stories. And so maybe there's an element of ideology here, which is that we know the Canaanites are the bad guys, and we've got to figure out how we get from Noah's 3 sons all the way to bad guys. And so this story makes an interesting tale. So maybe it's that. Yes? Liz?
So I kind of think that maybe this is such a bizarre story that maybe the person that's writing this story was sending a message to his people. I think it's totally different. I think he was like saying, okay, I'm going to put this in here. I'm setting a precedent. So you do this to me,
Yeah.
this is what's going to happen to you.
Yeah,
I see it from.
it's the elf on a shelf written in Genesis, right? Yeah, right. I need you to behave. So let me tell you the story, right? Yeah. So there's a question about not only what happened. I mean, there are always three stories, right? There's the what happened, there's the how was the story written or told, and then what are we supposed to deal with it, right? Yeah. And sometimes that middle step, the telling of the story, becomes the importance, not the right word, but becomes the primary lens through which, of course, the teaching is taught, right? Yeah. Any other observations? Yeah. Well, let me ask, how are those sons introduced to us there at the beginning of the story? How does the Bible identify Shem, Ham, and Japheth as what? In verse 18, the sons of Noah who went out of the ark, right? So this is not just a story about family. It's a story after the flood. The author wants us to know that this story is either the sequel or the denouement or something that goes with it. And so right away, the author didn't have to include those words. The Holy Spirit didn't have to guide us to hear those words. It could just be the sons of Noah were Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the story could continue. But the author wants us to remember that this is happening almost as if the story of the ark is just finishing, and this is what comes next, which means everything that the story teaches us is an outpouring of, a growth from the story of the flood. And so we find ourselves kind of struggling with that. What might that? I don't have the answer, but I bet together we can come up with several answers. Why might that be? Why is this story, how is this story connected to the flood story, as the next chapter of the flood story? Help me imagine. Yeah, Rob.
Well, so one thought would be, okay, everybody got in the ark, so that means that God only saved the good people, right?
Yeah.
And so, no, I mean, so this story says, no, not exactly. The story says sin is still around, and there are still going to be sinners and people that don't measure up to God.
Yeah.
God's desire, I guess.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So even after the flood, when God wanted to start over, we see that these three, right at the beginning, sort of fail, which teaches us a couple of things. On the one hand, it teaches us that something about human nature, but I wonder if it also is a lesson to those who would think that we can wipe our problems off or we can solve our problems by getting rid of people, right? I mean, I wonder if there's a message there that no matter what terrible, awful approach you might have to try to solve the disagreements of the world, that they're only waiting for you on the other side of it. Yeah, a mentor of mine when I was first ordained said to me, Evan, don't ever leave a church because the people there are driving you crazy. Those same people are waiting for you wherever you go next. You got to deal with them where you are, or they will follow you, right? Yeah. Right. Right. And the same is true for you. Don't ever leave a congregation. Don't ever leave a congregation because you want to leave those people, because those same people are waiting for you wherever you go. It's true for you as well. Yeah, that's right. All right. What else? How else is this a part of the story?
I don't know if this fits or not, but I was just thinking, God chose Noah because he felt that Noah was righteous in all things. But Noah is the one that got drunk on the wine and showed his nakedness and made himself vulnerable. So,
Yeah.
I mean, but Noah then curses his son for his wrongdoing.
Yeah. And so as much as Noah was the paragon of righteousness, and I will come back to how it is that we fault him. But regardless of what in particular is at fault, he's not perfect, and we see that he's not perfect. Yes, and so this story kind of again shows a chink in the armor of even the hero, even Noah. Yeah. What else? How else do you connect the story with the ark story? Yeah, I wonder. Part of it is, I think, also that part of it is we have to figure out, we have to explain how it is that we got from all being siblings, right, to the predicaments that we find ourselves in, right? And which is to say, it invites us to remember that despite the differences between the Canaanites and the Israelites, between the Allies and the Axis powers, between the Muslims and the Jews and the Christians and the Hindus, despite all of our differences, we all came out of one story. And even if this is just a story, there's something common to us. There's something as close as kinship to us, as close as these brothers. I mean, imagine, they were on that ark, not for 40 days, but for a really long time, 150 days, in some ways longer. They were on the boat for a really long time together. They had nobody else other than each other, their family. That's quite an ordeal. And that, despite that union, despite that closeness, maybe because of that closeness, those fractures developed. And then we see the destruction of that relationship, which is just a reminder of human nature and our experience of it. Yeah. All right, so look at verse 19, right? And maybe that's an echo of what I just said. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these three, the whole earth was peopled. I don't use the word people as a verb very often, but it fits, right? But I love the fact that the author is telling us what we know. Like we just read chapter 9, the first part. We know the implication of the story, but the author says it twice to make sure we don't miss it. That every human being on the planet came from Shem, Ham, and Japheth, at least as the story is told, which says something about our sisters and our brothers, our siblings, across any kind of line. Any other responses to that? Let's talk about the wine, right? Noah, a man of the soil, was the first to plant a vineyard. Why is that significant? Why bother to tell us that Noah is the first one to plant a vineyard? What is the author? What is God trying to tell us about Noah, about civilization, about culture, about the flood? What's the big deal with Noah and the vineyard?
To me, it sets a timeline, right? Because you can't plant a vineyard and make wine immediately. It's literally years.
Yeah.
So a long time has passed in order for him to make wine.
Thank you. Yeah. That scene from Castaway the Tom Hanks movie where they cut away and then they come back 7 years later and his beard's hanging down to here and he's lost a whole bunch of weight, right? Yeah, we need some way to tell how much time has passed. It's been a lot of time, right? Absolutely. What else is substantial about the fact that he planted a vineyard and was the first to do it? Yeah.
He likes his wine.
He likes his wine. He likes his wine, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, and there's something about, as human civilization develops, we move from hunter-gatherers to people who plant crops, but viticulture is different. I've been to a winery, to a vineyard, but I've never really grown grapes, and some of y'all know that it requires not just putting a seed in the ground, but you've got to tend it, right? A different level of tending that. And so it seems that civilization is advancing, and I wonder if part of that is to say that we picked up where we left off. I mean, we're not, all of the development that humanity had been through to get to Noah, we don't have to start all over with Adam and Eve, who are like, how am I going to grow anything in the ground? I've been kicked out of the garden. And I wonder if part of that is to show us that despite the fact that all the time has passed, that we haven't started all over again, that we're building on a story before, just reminding us of that. I'm curious, are we supposed to blame Noah for getting drunk? Does the author want us to read that and think, oh, Noah, maybe we shouldn't blame you because you were the first to grow wine, but we kind of blame you because you should have known better? I mean, how is this presented to us? Well, there's no answer other than what we can imagine. What do you think? What do you think? Are we supposed to blame Noah? Who thinks we're supposed to blame? Who thinks, I'm going to give you three options. Yes, we should blame Noah. No, we shouldn't blame Noah. Or it's somewhere in between. How many people think, yes, we should blame Noah? How many people think, no, we shouldn't blame Noah at all? How many think it's somewhere in the middle? Good Anglican answer. Yeah. I have to pull from a secondary source on this, but some of the commentaries I read said that in ancient literature, heroes get drunk all the time, and they're not really faulted for it. That's just kind of the nature of it. That's just what heroes do. They get drunk. And there wasn't this culture, right, that says, shame on you, shame on you. Now, when they get drunk, they're often vulnerable, and bad things often happen to them. And it's usually not a good way to be a hero, that it's hard to be the hero that you were made to be when you are drunk. And so there's the consequence of that, but the actual act of getting drunk isn't what is the point as it is what happens after that. And what happens to Noah? He passes out. He passes out unclothed, right? I bet there are some people in this room for whom there are embarrassing pictures in someone's hard drive about times when they were in college and had too much to drink and had some embarrassing pictures taken. It happens. It happens even to Noah. But that becomes the issue, right? The vulnerability. We don't portray our heroes in that light. Like that's the part of the story that we write out when we tell the hero epic, right? We don't talk about that. We don't mind if they throw a good party and have a little too much wine, but when they're passed out naked, that doesn't fit in our epic tale. So what does that tell us about Noah? And how does it fuel our story? What does it give us in the story? Where does it bring us? Yeah. You don't have to be perfect? Great. What else? What else? Yeah, Aubrey. Just kidding. He was embarrassed?
I think he might have been embarrassed if that's why he was telling his son, don't rat me out. You're cursed for that.
Yeah, and so then maybe that helps us get at the problem with Ham or Canaan, depending on how you read the story, right? That if this is a moment of true vulnerability, and everybody would have known it was a moment of vulnerability, and we don't normally tell the epic tales that way, don't talk about it. I mean, that's a problem. There's a culture of don't talk about it that we currently inhabit, which needs our attention for sure. But at least as this story is told to us, I wonder whether with a commentary on Ham is, why'd you embarrass your dad unnecessarily? Like, why not just walk out of the room and let it go? Why, when you're at a dinner party with friends, is that the moment that your son or daughter decides to tell the embarrassing story about you, right? Right, about how angry you were earlier that day when they wouldn't clean their room, right? right? And some of the things that you yelled, right? So, so we get the story that even though we might not blame Noah for getting drunk, we acknowledge his vulnerability, this out-of-character moment, the consequence of this drunkenness. And then as the story unfolds, the significance of him lying uncovered is this embarrassing nakedness. And then Ham sees it and tells his brothers. So what is the crime? Is it the seeing of the nakedness, which is a Levitical thing? If you read Leviticus, you're not supposed to see the nakedness of your father or your mother, or a lot of other people for that matter. Is the narrative the fact that he told his brothers? What the crime? What? Help me understand that. Let your imagination kind of fill that out. What's Ham's crime? I'm gonna come back here to Darren.
That he didn't do anything about it. He saw him and he just left him.
Okay, there's another bit that it's not just about seeing it and talking it, that he didn't do anything about it. That he had the ability to cover him. Just cover him up. Right, just cover him up. Yeah, but he left him vulnerable. So maybe it's not just about nakedness. Maybe it's a symbol of that. Maybe he left his father vulnerable and didn't do anything about it. His father's guard was down and he didn't say anything about it. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. What else? How else would you describe the crime, the fault that Ham has? How else? What else? Well, read what happens next. Right? The author slows everything down. We've had broad brush strokes. He was the first to plant a vineyard. Right? This kind of years have gone by, and we're just we're speeding through it like it's nobody's business. And then we get to verse 23. After Ham tells his brothers outside, everything slows down and we get lots of details. Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both of their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. Why does the author draw us into those details? Because the author wants to contrast, right, their behavior with their brothers. This becomes by implication, what Ham was supposed to do. Ham was supposed to cover his dad. Ham was supposed to cover it up and let's move on. But the brothers Shem and Japheth do it, right? Yes, we see that. Maybe. There are lots of commentators and preachers and individuals who study this passage, and they come to the same realization that we've already named, which is the punishment that happens isn't worth it. It's not fair. The Bible's often not fair. As I tell my children, life isn't fair either. So quit thinking that that's going to get you anywhere. That's not fair. But a lot of people respond to this and say something else must have happened. Something else must be going on. Some commentators think that there's a sexual connection here that's unspoken or unwritten, maybe even something too detestable to write down. And the reader is supposed to understand that, as it is in Leviticus and elsewhere in the Bible, to know someone's nakedness, to uncover someone's nakedness, is a euphemism for a relationship, right? And so we see that, whether that was Ham and his father, other people think it was Ham and his mother, we don't know, but whatever it is, maybe it was that. Other commentators, and the ones that I prefer, say that's ridiculous. Quit trying to be a Westerner and make sense of the story. Let the story stand for what it is. The reality is what we've already come to, which is his father was vulnerable, and he, instead of fixing it, went outside and started talking about it. And as we imagine how, and we heard this question earlier, Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done, we can imagine then that there are whispers. There are whispers maybe in the community. What's the community look like at this point? How many children have they had at this point, right? But there's a sense that Shem and Japheth might not even be able to look at their father in the eye, and their father knows something's amiss. And so what we're drawn to, especially as this story of family, the first family all over again, unfolds, we're caught in those hyper-family relationships. What does it mean to honor one's father? What does it mean to be the dutiful son? How are brothers supposed to interact with each other? And those questions become larger than just this story. They become an imprint for us, a blueprint for us, kind of an invitation to us in our own family relationships. Thoughts about that? Responses to that? Okay.
Is there any indication that Shem and company
Yeah. 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 Great question. Is there any sense in which the other brothers might have told their father what had happened, right? And there's sort of there's a little teasing there. Yeah, I don't know. It's up to us to imagine how the story unfolded. Yeah, and I think that verse 24, Noah awoke and knew what his youngest son had done. It doesn't really matter how it happened, but he got there. But the author allows us to tell that story in our own way. Yeah. And so there's a sibling rivalry. Also, what's it like when your younger brother or your older brother, whichever one, does the right thing all the time and you keep getting in trouble, right? So there's also that sibling relationship here, not just a father-child relationship, right? And the father or mother then prefers the other brother or sister because of what she or he has done, and leaves us out. Read again the story of Joseph and his brothers, right? His father loved Joseph, and so Joseph became kind of an impudent, arrogant so-and-so that nobody liked. They got thrown into a pit and sold into slavery, right? Yeah. So we're seeing that. We're seeing these seeds of human nature, unfolding before us, yeah. So I don't have an answer for it, but I'm asking anyway. Why does Noah curse Canaan? Canaan didn't do it. Ham did it. Canaan's his son. The author wants, in verse 22, right, wants us to know Ham, the father of Canaan. Have I mentioned that Ham was Canaan's father? Ham was the one who did it, but cursed be Canaan, right? And we don't know. We don't know. It's blurry. Our best guess, it seems, is, as we saw earlier, that the Canaanites are those people that we know are the enemies of God, right? Look in chapter 10, at the bottom of that first side of the page. The descendants of Ham, Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. Canaan became the father of Sidon and Heth, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Arkacites, the Zenites. It's not exactly the same list of peoples, but we kind of remember that when the people of God moved into the promised land, the peoples that were standing in their way, right, were the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites. And so by the time this story gets told, long after Israel had been set free from Egypt, long after they had moved into the promised land, long after they had defeated all their enemies, this was a way of remembering that story and how we got back, which is such a bizarre thing. I mean, imagine at the end of a national calamity or a national war, telling the story of that in a way that reminds us that our enemies, whom we've wiped off the face of the earth, were once our brothers and sisters. What an interesting story. What an interesting way of telling that story. And the fact that this story gets told and written down long after that had happened tells us something about the human need for connection and kind of confrontation of our human nature, even at its worst. Yeah. We'll take a look at the curse itself, right? Noah says, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." Anything in that catch your eye or your ear? Anything catch you? Yeah, up until this point, and a commentator had to remind me of this, up until this point, slavery wasn't an institution. Which is to say, it's a human institution, but the fact that the institution of owning a person as property, which has had many manifestations throughout the millennia, even up till this day, today, slavery is still an issue that humanity wrestles with. But there's something about this moment as the story is told, the unfolding, just as soon as we get out of the ark. We're not even one generation or two beyond the ark, and already we're talking about owning other people. That's just how amazing it is to me that's kind of fundamental, that sense of either physical dominance or economic dominance becomes expressed in the worst possible way. And there it is, right there in the story. Any reflections on that or thoughts about that? Yeah.
It seemed to me that first thing the story tells us that the ark didn't work, right? Like
Yep.
Noah, and if it was all beautiful, then we wouldn't have these conflicts,
Yeah.
right? So God's failed in his attempt to clean house.
Yes.
And so in the context of it being written many generations after, isn't this just simply justification for the slavery and for hating others and for separating us versus them? So it's okay for us to prosper and use them. And the simplest explanation is that it's justification.
Okay.
To me.
Yeah, thank you. That isn't where my mind went, but that doesn't mean it's not right. Yeah, that's a good point. It's a good point. Does this then become justification? Maybe, right? Certainly. I mean, the preachers from 150 years ago or so would use passages like this to justify the owning of individuals. Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Rob?
I was just thinking back to that whole kind of tie the thread back that I mentioned earlier, honor thy father and mother, right? Mm-hmm. So the worst way that you could kind of condemn somebody or of that flaw would be to curse your son as opposed to cursing you directly. Yeah. And then to me, the other thing is that slavery, being a slave to your brothers, is almost also kind of the absolute worst thing you could could do to somebody, I guess, to me.
Yeah, it's a fundamental denial of that identity, that personhood, and that relationship. Excuse me.
To me, it kind of says that when later on in the Bible, when the Israelites do make slaves of Canaan's relatives, that it's justified. Yeah. That it's okay for them to be slaves.
Yeah, right. I mean, yes. I mean, we know that Canaan, the peoples of Canaan, will be subjugated, and so this story gets told that way. Yes, interesting that it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's still, we hold that in tension, which maybe that's, if there is something to hold on to, it is the tension between the justification of that subjugation of the peoples, but also the fact that we're of the same family. Isn't that odd? And it's irreconcilable, right? Fundamentally, which is say we're gonna do it even if we don't have a good explanation for it, but we've got a justification, and that's kind of all we need. So think about how the story unfolds for us. Think about the story held on for us. The story didn't have to be in the Bible. Some people note for us that when they got on the ark, these three sons had wives with them. When they got off the ark, the wives are missing. In fact, right, and some wonder whether this story kind of got out of place, but it doesn't make sense before the flood, because why would you put Ham on the boat with you? And so anyway, but the story needed to be told. It's a story that had to be told. It's a story that God's people had to tell, strange though it might be. And so we're left with that strange story that doesn't really fit, but of course is a full expression of our own struggle and our own sort of international, intercultural, interfaith struggle. And so we're left with that question, why bother with this part of the story? Why continue with it? I think it's more than just an explanation for the divisions. You could leave out these verses and go straight on to chapter 10. These are the descendants of Noah's sons and the children that are born to them, and get the table of nations that we see in chapter 10. We could get that story, but there's something about that relationship and the conflict there that we don't want to let go of. One commentator, a man named Klaus Westermann, suggests that at this point we have to remember that the only thing that keeps the stories going, the only thing that keeps the traditions, the histories going, are that things are passed from one generation to another. That in this time, the only thing that makes it possible for us to know about Adam and Eve, to know about Enoch, to know about Cain and Abel, the only thing that makes that possible is that Noah and his children were preserved in the ark. Ham and the falling out between father and son that unfolds threatens that. It threatens to undo that. Give me just a second. It threatens to undo that story. It threatens to unravel it. The need for continuity, the need for relationship is so important. The author wants us to remember that if we lose touch even in families, even in conflict, then something gets broken off. And then we find ourselves able to name those who were once our kindred as our sworn enemy, because that continuity is broken. And so we find ourselves encountering this full brokenness in the story, and the need to remember the importance of hanging on to it if possible. Liz.
So Eve in the beginning is such a major factor in the story, and then you get here with Noah, and there's no females ever mentioned. So when does the next female come into play? And so was it females purposely left out because they were a problem? are insignificant, obviously. So when does the next female show up in the story?
I can't remember if in chapter 11 sons and daughters are mentioned at the Tower of Babel, but chapter 12 is where we get Abraham and Abram and Sarai will show up. Sarai, it would be an interesting Bible study or class for us, is to kind of trace her journey and the strength that she represents. But of course, these stories were written down by men and propagated by men and taught to men and women. Not only were girls not given access to the storytelling, the teaching, the yeshiva, the community of learning, but they were conveniently written out of the story. Yeah, a lot of times. And so anytime we see the preservation of the woman's identity and woman's voice, it sticks out to us. It means something to us. Absolutely. Great observation. So here we have it. That's Noah and the ark, the struggle that we're left with, a struggle of sort of the darkness of human nature at its fullest, and the reality that even after you try to cleanse the earth and start over again, that trouble is still there. And so we find ourselves with a God who chooses to stay engaged with us despite that. And our ability to know that and see that and tell that story depends upon our willingness not only to stay in relationship with God, but relationship to one another, to those who have gone before us and those who will come after. And so we find ourselves in this story reaching the limit of that, at least in one branch of the children, and then invited to recapture that in some way or another. I've enjoyed the class. I hope you have. Don't forget next week during this time, the Becoming Beloved community will report on the pilgrimage that they took to Memphis, to Montgomery, Alabama, and to Atlanta, and invite you to consider whether you might join them in that work. I hope you'll be here for that presentation next week. Thank you all very much.